Welcome to the US Eagle Claw YouTube channel. The policies followed by the Moscow administration are increasing the tension of the Ukraine-Russia war with each passing day. In Russia, which was destroyed by the mobilization decision, protest demonstrations and actions against the regime started to gain momentum as before. Vladimir Putin's war strategies almost divided the citizens of the country into two. While a small fraction of citizens in Russia support the ongoing war in Ukraine, the vast majority of the country is totally opposed to the mobilization and warfare. The decision to mobilize in the Moscow administration had a very negative effect. In fact, this risky decision taken by Putin led to rumors that the government would change in the Moscow administration. At that time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, was shown as the new Russian leader. The gang members of Prigozhin, nicknamed Putin's chief, were thought to be much more active and successful in the Ukrainian war than the Russian regular army. Especially with the loss of Kherson, chaos and panic increased in Russia. Citizens used to fill the streets of Russia. Locals argued that the war in Ukraine had damaged Russia and that the Moscow army's casualties had increased unnecessarily. Since the beginning of the war, however, the number of Russian casualties has reached almost 100,000. Russian defense ministers Shoigu and Vladimir Putin tried to reduce these numbers a little lower to calm Russian citizens, but the fire of the rebellion had already engulfed Russia, and the anger of the local people against the government had become unstoppable. As in the first days of the mobilization decision, Russian citizens again began to march to government buildings and military registration offices. Moscow Square surrendered to the flood of people. Every day in Russia, fires, explosions, protest demonstrations, violent actions against the government and the mobilization decision began to revive. In the Moscow army, too, the situation seemed no different than in Russia. The newly mobilized Russian soldiers had fierce fights with their commanders every day. The torture and ill treatment in the army was incessant. In particular, the soldiers mobilized from the autonomous republics affiliated to Russia began to come to the fore in actions against rebellion and war. In the past days, one of the most resounding acts of these rebellions and uprisings took place in Kazan. The images that emerged at a Russian military base in the city of Kazan shook the agenda deeply. The mobilized soldiers marching to this Russian base shouting slogans aroused quite a panic. Mobilized Russian soldiers preparing for the war in Ukraine were carrying out a mass action in Kazan, in the southwestern part of Russia. The footage showed uniformed soldiers walking towards a guarded gate of the aforementioned Russian base and trying to get it. After a short quarrel, this group who wanted to enter forcefully opened the door and suddenly started rushing towards the Russian base. After the footage of the incident was shared with the media, Twitter users also took action and wrote how violent the rebellion was. A Twitter user tried to convey the event in detail to people with a huge riot headline at a military base in Kazan, Russia. Yes, the scale of the rebellion was quite high. The soldiers who participated in the uprising in Kazan complained of inadequate equipment and health problems. These mobilized Russian soldiers, now losing their patience, refused to go to the war front in Ukraine and wanted to return to their homes. The guards at the Russian base tried to stop this angry group, but the number of guards was considerably less than the enraged soldiers in the group. This rebellion set an example for other soldiers in the Moscow army who opposed the war. Today, the vast majority of senior generals, officers, and active frontline soldiers in the Russian army want the war in Ukraine to end. In fact, there are certain reasons why Russian soldiers think this way. At the start of the war on February 24, 2022, the majority of the soldiers in the Moscow army supported the offensive operations in Ukraine and believed that the war would be concluded in a very short time in favor of Russia. At this time, however, thanks to the massive resistance of the Kiev army, the invading troops were stunned, as the most of them had to withdraw from the Ukrainian cities. Because no one expected that the Ukrainian army would rise in such a short time and quickly liberate their country's lands, then Zelensky's soldiers started to play big, and after retaking Kherson, turned their target to the Crimea. Crimea and its surroundings were a very important center for both Russia and Ukraine, especially since the beginning of the war. The mysterious and assertive statements of the Ukrainian leader Zelensky about this peninsula scared the Moscow government. The Ukrainian leader, in a statement he made in the local media, announced that everything started in Crimea and will end in this peninsula. Shortly after Zelensky's statement, striking events began to take place around this region. In the Crimean city of Sevastopol, the Black Sea Russian fleet entered the target of the Ukrainian army. We witnessed the first drone attack in history in this region. Caught off guard, the Russian Navy could not get rid of the Ukrainian army's submarine drones and unmanned aerial vehicles. This attack, organized by Ukrainian armed forces, almost resembled a slice of Hollywood movies. Admiral Makarov, the most important ship in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, was also in the port where the attacks took place. Every time the drones of the Ukrainian army crashed into the Russian ships, there was a huge explosion of flames and the seawater was reaching quite high. Russian Navy personnel were trying to respond to the Ukrainian drone attacks, but the orders of the Russian commanders were to exit the attack with the least damage. As a result of these historic drone attacks of the Ukrainian army, 4 more Navy members, including the Russian flagship Makarov, were severely damaged. The Moscow administration decided to turn off the security cameras on the Sevastopol coast to hide the effects of these attacks, but the size of the attack was so great that the world media talked about this historic initiative of the Ukrainian army for days. After these striking events, the hope of the soldiers in the Russian army against the Ukrainian war was almost completely lost. The ammunition of the Kiev soldiers was constantly being replenished, as the USA and the West also supported the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers, on the other hand, had insufficient Soviet-era guns, tanks, and other military equipment to counter the Ukrainian army. For this reason, most of the soldiers in Putin's army were aware of everything, while the cold breath of death was felt on the neck of the Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian front. The attacks of the Ukrainian army and the dawn operations continued at full speed. Ukrainian leader Zelensky, on the other hand, was able to voluntarily recruit thousands of soldiers to the Ukrainian army without any explanation. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, including female Ukrainian citizens, stood ready to fight for the independence of their country and the integrity of their lands. In fact, the significant difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian troops explained quite well the course of the war in favor of the Kiev government. In Zelensky's army, participation was not necessarily enforced. Ukrainian citizens were involved in the defense of the country of their own free will, but things were quite different in Russian leader Vladimir Putin's army. From the first day that Putin announced the decision of the mobilization application, he had given the signals that this application would proceed in a completely forced way without their citizens noticing in any way. In the past weeks, Vladimir Putin, who announced that they have reached a sufficient number of soldiers, still continues their secret mobilization practices in the country in solidarity with the Russian Ministry of Defense. When we consider this situation, we arrive at the assumption that the number of soldiers lost in the Russian army, which is wanted to be hidden, is high. According to the intelligence reports of most countries, the number of Russian soldiers and casualties to date has approached 100,000, but no one knows the exact number. Most estimates are that the Russians lost many more soldiers during the Ukraine war than this number. With the arrival of the winter season, it is expected that all the truth that the Russian government has been hiding will become as white as the snow falling in Ukraine. We will see it all together. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications in order to be informed about new videos. Thank you for watching us.